I'm here in Washington, D.C. to talk to two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist James Risen, author of several books including State of War, The Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration, and Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. Risen was not only relentlessly attacked under the Bush administration for his coverage of warrantless wiretapping, but was subpoenaed by the Obama administration over his expose on a botched CIA sabotage operation in Iran. He went rogue and published the story in his book after the U.S. government got the New York Times to kill it. Threatened with jail time from the government, Risen went through 7 years of legal battles to protect his source. In the face of this repression, he never compromised their identity. As one of the nation's leading voices on the national security state, I sat down with Risen to talk about his experience being targeted and what he's exposed that's put him in the crosshairs of the U.S. empire. So you're here, you're not behind bars. How does it feel for the first time in a while to not have the government trying to arrest you?
It's good. I mean, it took 7 years, I think they were after me, and finally they dropped the case. They dropped coming after me, and I feel like I beat them, you know, and it did, I think it's forced at least the Obama administration and the Justice Department to step back and back off reporters. So I hope that's the legacy of my case, is that they don't try to do this to some other reporter.
It is truly fascinating. I mean, what kind of precedent does that set for the government to enlist charges not only against the alleged leaker, but the journalist who was simply publishing the leaks?
Yeah, I mean, my case started in the Bush administration, and at first they threatened me with, the Bush administration threatened to use the Espionage Act against me. And they threatened me with, they were going to charge me with obstruction of justice when I refused to cooperate. And they called me, you know, they told my lawyers at first they weren't sure whether they were going to prosecute me individually. And so it was a very long marathon of dealing with the government. And I think I finally got them to back off. And it was exhausting. So.
And let's talk about the subpoena that came against you, James. You say that it was not only used to use you to build a case against the alleged source of yours, but also just to target you for your work.
Yeah, I think the background of the story is that in 2005, we broke, Eric Lischblau and I broke the story of the NSA's domestic spying by the Bush administration, and that was in my book, State of War. And then I think the government, the Bush administration, was furious that we broke that story and we disclosed the existence of the NSA domestic spying. And so I think they were looking for something else to get me on. I think they decided they didn't want to come after the New York Times on the NSA story because it was such a big constitutional issue. And so I think they were looking for other ways to come after me. And so I think they looked through my book, State of War, and tried to find things to investigate. And I know that they conducted leak investigations of at least 3 different chapters before they decided which one to come after me on. So they were looking for something to get me on, to try to isolate me from the New York Times.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this story briefly because it's absolutely fascinating. New York Times was threatened by the Bush administration. They held onto this story for over a year, James, about Stellar Wind, the post 9/11 warrantless wiretapping program.
Right.
How did you finally get that story published?
Well, what happened was in 2004 we found out about it. We wrote a story and called the CIA and the White House and the NSA for comment. And immediately the Bush administration started a full-out lobbying effort to stop the New York Times from publishing the story, and they agreed not to run the story right before the 2004 presidential election. And then Eric Lischblau and I, right after the election, after that decision, we tried to get the editors to let us try again. And they did. They said, okay. And so we did more reporting and more writing. And then we presented it again to them in December 2004. And they again said no, under pressure from the Bush administration. And so I decided to put it in my book, State of War. And then when I had finished writing the book, I told the editors, it's going to be in my book. You should publish it now. And there was a lot of, they were furious at me. And we had a long series of very contentious meetings about that. And finally, my book was coming out in January 2006. And they ran the story in mid-December 2005. So.
Unbelievable. You know, I think people might find it hard to believe that Bush administration officials actually threatened the New York Times, and not just the New York Times, several media organizations, with actually blood on their hands from future terrorist attacks. I mean, talk about kind of this culture of censorship and how it operates on behalf of the government, especially in a post-9/11 era.
They would constantly say that this was the crown jewel of the counterterrorism program, and that if we revealed it, that we would be aiding the terrorists, and that the next terrorist attack would be our fault. And it was just this full-out campaign to try to convince the New York Times that if they, wrote stories, they would be responsible for Americans dying. And I think they did that with other media organizations too. And it was just, the editors went along with it for a while, and then after a while they began to realize, we can't keep going along with these kind of efforts by the Bush administration.
Yeah, that seemed like there was this culture of stenography almost to a certain extent, and you describe, you couldn't sit with this story, especially in the wake of the New York Times, Judith Miller, all these people kind of perpetrating the WMD's story, and they said it was the crown jewel. They said it was essential for their terrorism efforts or counterterrorism efforts. Why did you disagree, James?
Well, we had a lot of sources. Eric Lischblau and I had a lot of sources who were telling us they thought that this program, the NSA program, was illegal or unconstitutional. And so I thought that was the argument. That was the reason to write the story. What we were revealing was that they were using illegal or unconstitutional means to surveil people electronically. Everybody knows that the government conducts surveillance. So we weren't revealing the existence of surveillance that nobody knew about. What we were revealing was that the government was going around the law. And so I always thought that the argument that this is somehow damaging national security was false, because it was, we were just describing, we weren't saying, okay, they're spying on this guy and he doesn't know it. What we were saying is they're going around congressional law to do this in a way that a lot of people within the government think is unconstitutional. So I thought that was a natural story that should be written.
The person accused of being your source, Sterling, was convicted of 9 counts under the Espionage Act. You've called Obama the greatest threat to press freedom in a generation. You've called Eric Holder his chief censorship officer. What earned them these titles?
The Obama administration continued to target journalists and whistleblowers in a way that is unprecedented in modern American history, going back to at least the Nixon administration. They used the Justice Department to crack down on aggressive investigative reporting by issuing subpoenas to reporters, not just me, but to other people, and by prosecuting whistleblowers. They've prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined in the history of the United States. And they have cracked down on aggressive investigative reporting in a way that no one has since Nixon. So I think that's why I said what I did, because they have shown a real zealous approach to going after journalism.
Were you surprised when Obama continued and in some cases exacerbated that war on whistleblowers?
Yes, I was shocked that in my case, they subpoenaed me and the Bush administration subpoenaed me, and I thought when Obama came in they were going to drop the case, and instead they continued it and was even more, they were even more aggressive about not just me but other cases since then. So I still don't quite understand why a supposedly liberal Democratic administration did this.
So-called most transparent administration, right?
Right.
What was so important about that Iran story in your book that you felt it needed to be published, and even risking that culture of censorship again?
Well, as I said in some of the affidavits in my case, this became I actually had to write affidavits to the court explaining that. Why did I think this was important? Basically, if you remember in 2003, we went to war with Iraq based on faulty intelligence over whether or not Iraq had a nuclear weapons program or a biological or chemical weapons programs. And so at the time, the next war that seemed like it was about to happen was war with Iran. Were we going to go to war with Iran over what people said was their nuclear weapons program? And at the time, there were all these hyped arguments about the state of Iran's nuclear weapons program. And so I thought it was very important to show how flawed the U.S. intelligence efforts were on Iran's nuclear weapons program. And this operation, which was botched and poorly managed, shows how badly flawed the CIA's efforts at understanding the Iran program was. And I thought that was critical at a time when the debate was all about, okay, what do we do about Iran and what do we do about their nuclear weapons program? And after my book came out, I don't know if you remember, a year later, the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate showed they completely reversed course on what the CIA thought was the status of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. They showed for the first time in 2007 in that National Intelligence Estimate that the Iranians had not built a bomb, that they had stopped work on an actual weapons program. And that was a complete reversal from the intelligence at the time I wrote my book, which I thought vindicated what I had written. It showed that they were admitting themselves how flawed their previous intelligence was.